The GTX 970 is a GPU which is shrouded in controversy, and Nvidia even settled a class action lawsuit due to the misleading nature of the 4GB of VRAM on this graphics card. But despite that, how does this 9-year-old GPU get on in 2024? Is it considered e-waste at this point, or can it still play some games at 1080p? Well, it's time to find out as I've run some benchmarks. Going back to the controversy around the GTX 970, and it stems from the VRAM configuration. Essentially, it's a 3.5GB graphics card plus 500MB. That is because 3.5GB of the GDDR5 memory is set up in the standard normal way, so it's full bandwidth memory. However, the extra 500MB isn't set up properly, which can lead to drastic performance losses when users of the GTX 970 were using more than 3.5GB of VRAM. So essentially that last 500MB of video memory has much less bandwidth. So when games are using more than 3.5GB of VRAM, which is very likely in 2024, lots of performance will be lost. Despite the controversy, the GTX 970 was an insanely popular GPU back in its day. It even topped the Steam hardware survey as the most popular graphics card in the world, so I think it's fair to say a lot of people looked past the 3.5GB of VRAM thing. And a lot of people bought this graphics card because at $329 it was very reasonably priced, which is a lot better pricing than, let's say, the RTX 4070, and in its time it was insanely powerful as well, offering massive performance leaps over the previous GTX 770. It's also actively supported by Nvidia with game-ready driver updates, so newer games are receiving optimizations on the GTX 970, which is a lot more than what AMD are doing with the graphics cards of this time. However, does the 9-year-old GTX 970 still play games pretty decently at 1080p? Or is it just a GPU you should skip out on? To find out if it's got the oomph to play games at 1080p, I've tested it in my main GPU testing system, which has an Intel Core i5 12400F, 32GB of dual rank, dual channel DDR4 memory running at 3200MHz, an MSI B660-A Pro motherboard, and a 1TB NVMe Gen 4 SSD. All testing today has been done at 1080p with no upscaling like AMD's FSR, and the GTX 970 has been left at its stock out of the box settings. So let's see how this thing gets on. Starting off the game today with Cyberpunk 2077, and to be fair, this is not the best performing game on a GTX 970. That's because on the low preset with medium textures, as I am aware of that 3.5GB of VRAM, and the average frame rate is just 39 FPS with a 1% low of 26 frames per second. So Cyberpunk isn't really all too much of an enjoyable experience on a GTX 970, but hey, it is playable, so if you really wanted to play Cyberpunk, it's playable on a GTX 970. Forza Horizon 5 is up next, and on the medium preset, performance wasn't actually too bad, getting just 58 FPS on average with a 1% low of 48 frames per second. This means that the game runs pretty smoothly on the medium preset, but getting just below 60 FPS on average isn't ideal in a racing game like this, so maybe set it to low or adjust some settings onto the low preset, and you might get a bit of a smoother experience in Forza Horizon 5. However, it is playable on a GTX 970. During the Steam winter sale, I picked up a few bargains, and Hogwarts Legacy was one of them, so I've updated the benchmarking list with this game today. On the low preset, the GTX 970 actually exceeded my expectations, getting 47 FPS on average with a 1% low of 37 FPS. In the Hogsmeade area, which I do believe is one of the more intensive areas of the game, this isn't terrible performance, and if you wanted to play Hogwarts Legacy and you had a GTX 970 lying around, just know it is playable when you set all the settings down to low. Fortnite is a much more sensible title for the GTX 970, and to be fair, performance on DirectX 12 it left a little more to be desired, if I'm honest. That is because on the low preset with a high view distance and high textures, the average frame rate was just 115 with a 1% low of 62 FPS. This 1% low figure does indicate a bit of stutter, and even then 115 for the average FPS isn't particularly great. So what I would probably do with Fortnite is enable the performance API and set it all down to low, and if you've got a relatively decent processor, performance shouldn't be too bad. Essentially in Fortnite, don't use DirectX 12 with the GTX 970, use the performance API instead. Rainbow Six Siege is another esports game which actually performs pretty decently on the GTX 970. Setting it to the low preset here, netted 221 FPS on average with a 1% low of 166. So this performance is great. Say if you've got a 240Hz monitor, you're set to go in Rainbow Six Siege, and the GTX 970 is perfect for that. Just like Hogwarts Legacy, Spider-Man is a new addition to the benchmarking roster today, and to be fair, it performed quite decently. On the medium preset, it performed pretty decently, getting 68 FPS on average with a 1% low of 49 FPS, which isn't terrible performance when you consider the price point of this graphics card. For £40, 68 FPS in a modern game like Spider-Man is not too bad. Yes, the frame pacing is a bit off when you're web slinging through Manhattan, but at the end of the day, it is still very playable on a graphics card which is as cheap as this. Horizon Zero Dawn on the original preset still looks pretty good. It's the preset that the PS4 would have used. However, the GTX 970 doubles the frame rate, going up to 62 FPS on average, and the 1% low also fared quite well with 50 frames per second. So on the original preset, if you wanted to play Horizon Zero Dawn on this graphics card, I mean, that is very smooth, playable experience. And to be fair, 60 FPS in a game like Horizon Zero Dawn is what you should be after, because you don't really need a high frame rate in a game like this. Last game up today is F123, and performance on the GTX 970 here isn't too bad. On the medium preset, 83 FPS on average with 72 FPS for the 1% low isn't terrible performance by any means. However, I would recommend lowering it to the low preset to get more frames per second in this game. As F123 is more of a competitive racing game, you want as many frames per second as possible. So what I'd recommend is, to get that, lower the settings down to low. You're not really going to be caring about how good the game looks if you're competing. So that's what I'd recommend in this title. But if you've got a 60Hz 1080p monitor, leave it on the medium preset. The game looks pretty decent and the performance is good enough as well. So then, the GTX 970, at least in the games tested today, has shown that it can still play games at 1080p if you're willing to lower the settings down to low, and if you're willing to have an experience that is less than 60 FPS in most AAA games. But to be fair, when you're paying £40 for a graphics card, you're not going to be expecting 4K maxed out 144Hz. You've got to stay a bit down to earth. Yes, in the new AAA games like Hogwarts Legacy and Cyberpunk 2077, even though Cyberpunk's 3 years old at this point, but it's still considered a very hard game to run, you will be limited to low settings in these titles, and without a guarantee of reaching 60 FPS at them settings as well. So if you wanted to play some AAA games at 1080p with 60 FPS, I'd say definitely skip this graphics card. But if you were willing to take a bit of a performance hit and maybe play at 30 FPS, this GPU, it can probably do it in most games. And then there's the esports titles like Rainbow Six Siege and Fortnite. They will run fine on a GTX 970, and as I said in Fortnite, the performance API is a better bet there. Even the GTX 760 gets on quite well in that game on the performance API. So as long as you've got a fairly competent CPU with this thing, you're pretty set for a 144Hz 1080p gaming experience in competitive esports titles. Rainbow Six Siege performed great, but was there any doubt, because it's such an easy game to run. And F123, if you consider that an esports game, ran okay on the medium preset, but I'd recommend lowering that to low if you've got a 144Hz 1080p monitor. Right then, for £40, the GTX 970 has basically performed as I expected it to. Performance in Cyberpunk 2077 was not very great, but that's not really a shocker, as old GPUs don't really perform that well in this game. Hogwarts Legacy was a bit of a surprise, as it did actually perform pretty decently, but I've never tested it here on the channel, so I didn't really know what I was expecting. I would highly recommend picking a GTX 970 up for less than £40 though, as the RX 580 4GB, which is a more powerful GPU, and it doesn't have the dodgy VRAM configuration, can be found on eBay auctions for around £45. So if you're a bit more patient, that extra £5 does go a long way into getting a much better graphics card, in my opinion. I want to do some testing here on the channel to see how badly the GTX 970 performs when you're saturating more than 3.5GB of video memory, as apparently it does really hamper the performance quite a lot. So I'm thinking of getting a similarly performant GPU, I think the word is, maybe an R9 290, I think is the closest GPU I've got to it. So I think that might be a decent comparison video that might hit your sub box sometime soon. With that being said, I arrive at the end of the video. The TLDR is, don't spend a penny over £40 on a used GTX 970, and I'd probably recommend a price around £30 to £35 is ideal in my opinion, just because of the competition this GPU has, with the RX 580 4GB going for around £45 to £50 on the used market, and the 8GB version going for £60 to £65. Both of these GPUs don't have any VRAM problems, and they are a bit faster as well. So it's kind of hard to recommend going out and buying a GTX 970, but if you've already got one in your PC and you just want to play esports games, I think you're set, because yeah, it's a decent GPU for that. So if you enjoyed this video, there are 2 other GPU benchmarking videos right here, which might be right up your alley. And if you got this far into the video, I would like to say thank you for sticking around this long. And if you really like the video, consider leaving a like and subscribe. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next one, and have a good rest of your day.